John Kunze is a pioneer in the theory and practice of digital libraries with a background in computer science and mathematics. He wrote BSD Unix software tools that come pre-installed with Mac and Linux systems, which sounds super exciting, and I can't wait to hear more. I'll stop there with your bio, John. There's a lot of technical terms in here that I think you would do better to explain than me. So welcome, John. And then just as a note, remember to let Sib know when you need the slides changed.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jenny and Sib. My name is John Kunze. I spent my career as a staff computer scientist at the University of California, where I wrote software, policy, information standards, and articles. It's been a while since I've stepped back for a broad look, but in 2001, I began working on the foundations of the University of California Libraries' then new digital preservation program. Since about 2006, I've worked with data centers, museums, archives, and libraries on special problems in long-term access to research data and scholarly outputs. The rest of my bio even this doesn't really apply at this point. I'll just say I've been working in the public sector with partners like the Internet Archive, the National Library of France, the Smithsonian, Library of Congress, and that's always felt very meaningful to me. And I've always gravitated towards open access, open source, open data, open standards. And along the way, I met many wonderful and inspirational colleagues, including at least, my last count, 6 Ronins. Next slide, please. So let's start here with data entropy. Here's a figure that I borrowed from the NSF Data One initiative. It's well known to several Ronins, and it elegantly illustrates one part of the need for digital preservation in scientific research. It starts with the moment of publication of knowledge as represented by a journal article. Note that the traditional publication does not require making available any of the data, methods, or software used to reach the article's conclusions. So a reader who wishes to reproduce the results might try to get in touch with the author to ask if they're willing to share any of that supporting material. But there's a limited window of opportunity, since over time the knowledge locked in the author's head is decaying. So as memory fades, details are lost, accidents can happen, storage media can become damaged, or the data is misplaced during career changes, and eventually all memory is gone. So what's needed is a deliberate preservation strategy to guard against this kind of loss. Next slide, please. So why do we care about preservation in general? Libraries already preserve published scholarship, don't they? Well, sort of, and to a limited extent as constrained by budget, space, staff, and perceived value of the items they're saving. Seldom used items get deaccessioned or tossed, and only popular, affordable items exist in multiple copies at multiple libraries. Meanwhile, libraries are collecting less of the expensive items. For example, journal subscriptions have dropped sharply because of rising prices. The market is tight, and publishers and scholarly societies disappear, sometimes taking their holdings with them. And single copies of out-of-print material can disappear completely when the library of a small college, for example, closes. And that's been happening, and the Internet Archive rushes in and saves some of them. But far worse is that libraries don't systematically preserve non-published scholarly outputs. That means they miss a great deal, including things like data, software, images, methods, equipment, calibrations, inventories, vocabularies, notebooks, etc. The result is not good for the scientific and cultural records. We lose reproducibility when the data and software are lost. We lose the opportunity for others to further explore and mine the data and collections that supported just a few published articles. And the funders aren't happy when they have to pay a second or third time to recreate data for follow-on studies. Next slide. So why do we care about digital preservation? Well, the main answer is that so much research is now born digital and primarily based on born digital material. One great benefit, of course, is that digital storage takes up so much less physical space, and it can be made searchable and available to any internet user. As you probably know, digital scans of all the books in the Library of Congress easily fit on part of one desktop hard drive. Another great thing, of course, is that computer files consist of digital bits that can be copied cheaply and faithfully to backup media or newer storage systems as often as needed. Over time, old analog information will also have digital surrogates created for it, at least in parts of the world where digitization is affordable and can take place before the physical materials are lost. The pressure on digital preservation increases the more we rely on the digital. This is especially true when older material is so fragile that the act of digitizing it renders the original physical copy unusable. This is the case, for example, with some bound volumes of acid-rich paper for which each page is ready to crumble into pieces, and they do in fact disintegrate when a human being attempts to turn the page. So they can scan them with machines that vacuum pressure ways of actually lifting pages off after scanning. So fortunately for your mainstream stuff, it's not hard to find companies that will digitize or convert your own collections of old media, printed photos, photographic slides, floppy disks, VHS tapes, and CDs. It is common for people to underestimate the challenge of digital preservation. As you probably know, the first rule is to make backup copies. If you don't safeguard those digital bits, it's game over. Depending on the trouble you can afford to go to and the preciousness of the objects, you should make multiple copies. If you can, keep copies in different locations so they're not subject to the same single point of failure and not going to be destroyed by the same fire or flood. If you're really worried, store them with different cloud vendors and different machine architectures and in different countries. Held in different ways and places, not all the copies are vulnerable to the same bug or to the same infrastructure virus or the same cyber attack. At the University of California, we used to joke that we had copies in Berkeley, Los Angeles, and San Diego, so the same earthquake in coastal California would wipe out all the copies at once. At that time, we didn't have some of the choices available today from various cloud providers, which you can configure to spread copies across different regions and one continent or across different continents. Another important point is don't be afraid to distrust digital preservation for really precious things. Definitely keep a physical copy of vital photos and documents like certificates of birth and marriage, and the master key for your digital password manager. You might also do this for research that is especially critical or politically sensitive. The reason is that in order to experience digital materials requires special software and equipment to exist that didn't exist 20 years ago and may not exist 20 years from now. On the other hand, physical materials can be experienced with nothing more technologically advanced than a light source, such as a candle or the sun. Even if you need a magnifying glass, basic optical glass technology has been stable for over 400 years. Another reason for physical preservation is that what keeps offline objects inconvenient also makes them secure against online hacking. So let's return to making backup copies, since even that simple step can be hard. How many of you have worked for large organizations with dedicated, expensive IT staff who publicize the detailed backup procedures they follow And then you find out that their backups weren't actually there when you needed them. It's happened often enough at the University of California that the IT staff eventually stopped taking responsibility for personal computer backups. The new policy was you're responsible for your own backups. Fortunately, terabyte drives are cheap and take up very little room. They sit right next to you on your desk and about the size of a deck of cards. Extra copies are good to have, period, whether or not somebody designates them as backups. So go ahead and put secondary copies of your videos on your free YouTube account and secondary copies of your photos on your free Google Photos or your Flickr account. Use Dropbox or the equivalent for secondary copies if you have access. As I suggested, digital preservation is more complicated than just preserving the bits. Recall that digital files can only be experienced via software tools created specifically for certain digital formats. Those tools are constantly changing, often disappearing, and making the old formats unusable. There are lots of old word processor files that can no longer be read, except with old software running in computer museums. For a cost, those files might be converted to newer formats. Even if a tool or a converter is available, it may not be affordable. Then there's an alarming recent trend that concerns the temporary nature of digital rights. Increasingly, libraries, archives, and individuals do not have the right to make copies of content produced by the entertainment industry. So this means music, films, videos. Instead, we experience such content only through licenses, and they can be revoked at any time. So the companies that make these things are not cutting deals with libraries and archives any longer. They used to. And no libraries or archives have permission to preserve this content. So no one is preserving modern culture except the industry itself that is producing and charging for it. This is very worrisome because, for example, the US film industry assured everyone that they would preserve films for heritage, but they in fact lost 50% of all films made before 1950. They were lost or destroyed by accident, usually. So there's a reason that when I purchase music, I tried to do so from the artist directly. And I usually buy a physical CD. Yeah, I still have a CD drive so that I actually own the media and have the right to donate it to an archive later. Next slide, please. So this slide shows one breakdown of different kinds of information loss. You can think about two major categories: is hard loss, and where some or all of the digital data bits are missing. The second category is soft loss, which is when you actually have the bits, but you can't use them for some reason. In the first category, we have familiar terms from, say, the insurance world, where fire, flood, natural disaster, accident, etc., those cause the loss. In addition, in the digital world, we have failures in the hardware, software, electrical, power, infrastructure. Add to that, malicious attack, random vandalism, or targeted destruction. There's also unintentional loss due to nearly passive data entropy referred to on the first slide. And there's also unplanned loss from, this is a big one, from organizational change, such as when a project or a department or government agency loses funding or political support, and no one had developed a long-term data management strategy. So there were libraries that were set up to harvest websites from government agencies before they were shut down and taken offline. And the government had no plan for preservation. The second major category is soft loss, where you have the bits but cannot use them. The reasons for that vary. There's sort of a syntactic or formatting loss, where the basic file structure or a character set is not understandable. Generally, you'll have this situation when the file won't open at all. And part of that can be you've got a media problem, such as you have a floppy disk, but no floppy disk drive. A colleague of mine had to travel to a computer museum recently to read his floppies. More often, you have a stream of bits in a syntactic structure that your current software doesn't understand. So you have all the bits of that old WordStar document, but they're unusable when you try to open them in Microsoft Word. Now, the good news is that people have become a lot more aware of this problem, and they're thinking more about backward compatibility, and especially for some very widespread formats like HTML. You've got documents created in 1996 can be rendered faithfully 25 years later. And that's in the computer age, that's a very long time. Even more long lasting is just plain text. So the first internet standard created in 1969 is perfectly legible with today's text display software. So one piece of advice is to choose fairly standard formats and simple formats if you have that luxury. And consider converting your older formats to more standard formats. Another kind of loss is like semantic loss. When the file appears to open, but what is displayed makes no sense or is missing something foundational, like some fundamental incompatibility with the original. One of those sort of semantic rot areas is vocabulary. Language is much more malleable than we think, especially as decades go by. We use special vocabulary called metadata, which is sort of somewhere between humans and machines. You add information that to help people discover and use the data. So metadata is kind of close to human language, so we use terms like author, title, date, programmer, but you have to spell them exactly that way. But we're not always aware how quickly these things change. So the programmer column in that 20-year-old database of open source software might be invisible in a tool today because it's expecting that column to be called developer, because that's the new word for that activity. Lots of data also has dependencies on APIs or machine-to-machine interfaces that use metadata-like terms for the verbs and nouns that actuate the interfaces. They also assume the existence of a whole ecosystem of tools and websites surrounding your access, which actually complete the rendering of the information. This plays havoc with web archives that are saving web pages at scale, like an entire country. And so they have ways of, strategies for harvesting a website. It's not all done at once because you have to go and dig deeply into all the references on a page. So you might save a page on Tuesday, but not get the central image that's embedded in that page until Thursday, when the surrounding page has already changed. So this creates some very interesting puzzles for people accessing web archives. Finally, we get to legal loss, which I sort of alluded to earlier. When you don't have the right to save or to use the data format or the data itself. And so one thing you want to avoid is having your own data become inaccessible for these reasons. So we hear a lot about open access these days, but unfortunately, the forces of closed access are very powerful and they're doing very well. So what can you do to make sure that your own data is easy to save? So there's a Creative Commons was a set of licenses created. I think Larry Lessig was one of the main instigators. The idea was to try to make it easier to share things with instead of just sort of the hammer of copyright. So the safest Creative Commons license is called CC0, which is nearly public domain. It's open source, permits the It's an open license that permits the broadest possible sharing. So public domain is too open. It basically, you're saying you don't assert any rights. CC0 says you can share it completely without any friction. For a while, people were recommending another license called CC BY, Creative Commons BY, which requires attribution. And attribution is like, it's like use this, feel free to use it, but give me credit. And that's usually, it's considered that credit that's kind of like a disciplinary norm, and that the credit can be done correctly without this actual license, because when you have the license on there, what you're doing is you're preventing people from doing broad studies that say use 50,000 data sources, where it's just going to be way too expensive to track down and attribute credit to all 50,000 sources. It can be hard to do that for 14 sources, let alone 50,000. So that discourages, in a way, some of the new kinds of studies that are coming out. So another piece of advice is, try when you can to publish in open access journals. If you do publish in non-open access journals, you may know this already, but you don't need to sign away your copyright. It's usually not the showstopper that we once thought it was, and by keeping your rights, you can upload your manuscript or your data to open access repositories. And that's all good for improving chances for access and preservation. Next slide, please. Okay, so imagine your files exist and they're intelligible. What can you do now for the future? What platforms outside of your own computer can you use to share and archive them? Well, we're always on risky, shaky ground when we're trying to forecast the future. Nothing is forever, so we're making judgments and guessing. We're guessing, we try to figure out which services will be around in the future. So there are no firm answers. There are no companies starting up in the archiving space that are actually going to predict their own end, but most of them will disappear. And that's a sad fact. There have been several, well-known high-profile failures in the preservation space. One of them was the Digital Preservation Network. It started up, lots of expensive annual fees from major Ivy League institutions. 8 years later, it's dead. It's gone. All of the assets are gone. So it's interesting. We really need to take away some of the lessons. So you need to ask yourself about the sustainability of the organization behind it, the mission of that organization, et cetera. The Internet Archive has done a pretty good job in this. Since 1996, they've been taking a very, very practical way of, approach to just saving bits, and they do it cheaply. They do the impossible cheaply. They said, "Oh, we're gonna snapshot the World Wide Web every 6 weeks," and everyone said, "No way can you do that." And they did it, and they're still doing it. And that's just one corner of what they do. They're book scanning, converting records, lots of analog media, saving a bunch of television. Anyway, the Internet Archive lets anyone create a free account and deposit individual documents and data. So I strongly recommend that. Zenodo is another apparently very stable repository. It's big. It's in Switzerland, run by CERN, same place where the World Wide Web came out of. So that's another probably trustworthy for at least for a while. It's politics change, of course. But the Internet Archive is also subject to grants and as well. So in addition to this, there are many institutional and domain repositories out there. Some of them operate for a fee. and if you have an affiliation with certain institutions, you may have be able to deposit for free in some of those repositories. Archive.org, that's archive, arxiv.org, is a domain repository for physics, math, and computer science. So anyway, short of having an actual archival platform, can you at least share your stuff? Getting another copy of your open data or software outside your computer is always good for preservation. So by all means, maintain and share your software with GitHub. It's a very mainstream. It's an extra copy. It's just so much easier to sleep at night when you've checked your code into GitHub. Keep a copy of your data in Google Sheets. Just don't make it your only copy. And there are lots of other sharing platforms. I mean, tons of them. They disappear. They appear and disappear overnight. So be careful. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Next slide, please.
John, just a time check note. Sorry to interrupt you, but
Yeah.
got about 5 minutes left.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Okay. So what happens when a URL doesn't work any longer? This is a frustratingly common problem of reference and citation lists, especially ones that you've compiled after extensive, painstaking research. What we want is a long-term stable URL. Since around 1994, there were several solutions advanced for this concept that have been called persistent identifiers. They were all very similar and used an early web feature called redirection, which was forwarding. Basically, you create a stable URL that will be forwarded to whatever the current but less stable URL is. Forwarding takes place transparently, so users don't know what's happening. So the solutions that were proposed were split between those who claimed that this feature was high-tech and justified charging fees, and those who claimed, on the other hand, that the feature, which was built into all web servers, was actually low-tech and that charging for it was kind of silly. So this is an area I specialize in, so I get a bit opinionated. Long story short, you can choose free solutions, and these are URN, Perl, or ARC, or you can choose the fee-based solutions, which are Handle or DOI. Enough problems existed that in 2001, I created the ARC identifier scheme, which is on the next slide, please. So I'm only going to inflict 2 ARC slides on you today. ARC stands for Archival Resource Key. Its scheme is 21 years old, and last month we topped 1,000 registered organizations. It includes national libraries, university libraries, art museums, etc. Here's what an ARC looks like. It's first glance, it's a short, opaque URL with an internal label, ARK, telling you that it might actually be persistent. Who's using ARCs? Here's a small sample, from their for-profit, nonprofit, government agencies, lots of memory organizations on this slide. Next slide, please. What are people using ARCs for? For example, near the bottom, you can see that the Louvre Museum in France has assigned ARCs to all of its paintings. The heaviest users right now are like the genealogical research organization called Family Search. And there's a bunch of publishing applications. Portico has all the source files for all the mainstream published content. And they have something like 40 billion ARCs, but apparently only 100 million of them are interesting. So the Smithsonian's there, the Internet Archive's there, the National Library of France was an early adopter. So that's enough about ARCs. Next slide, please. So before closing, I just want to return to some larger themes in preservation. The world of information is vast, and in order to be visible to the audience you want to reach, your files, data sets, and bits need to be discoverable. That's done through the somewhat tedious process of adding metadata, like author, title, keywords, and abstracts. In the case of data sets, your metadata can include column names and geographical place names, time periods, license types. Openness counts. There's a school of thought that says dark archives are fine when you're afraid of releasing data prematurely or in getting scooped. But there's another school of thought that open archives get used, and what gets used gets loved. And what gets loved gets funded for preservation. Personally, I'd beware of over-reliance on dark archives, because people cannot care about what they cannot know. So the more your stuff is discoverable and usable via your investment in creating good metadata, the more likely other people will care about preserving it after you're gone. Discovery leads to use, use leads to caring, and caring leads to preservation. So that's it for this presentation.
Thank you so much, John. It's very informative.